Hello, and welcome to this week's Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law, editor of the Digest. You know, it's just 1 year ago that the brutal dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad was overthrown, and I'm very happy to have as my guest the Syrian analyst Malik al-Abdeh, managing director of Conflict Mediation Solutions. Malik, good to have you back on the podcast.
Always a pleasure.
Ahmed al-Sharaa, after his lightning-fast defeat of the Assad regime, emerged onto the world stage and was almost as quickly embraced by the world. In February, it was Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh. In May, Trump at the White House. Then there was a significant address at the UN in September, the first by a Syrian leader in decades, I believe. What do you make of the acceptance of a man who, not that long ago, was allied with Al-Qaeda?
Well, I think before we get into the personality of Ahmed al-Sharaa and why he's become very popular in many places, I think it's worth noting that the opening or the international community's opening to Syria actually began about 3 years ago. So we've seen positions towards Syria under Bashar al-Assad shift at the level of the Arab League, which allowed Syria to take up its seat after being expelled for over a decade. We've seen Saudi Arabia embrace Syria under Bashar al-Assad. We've seen the UN change its position. There were secret negotiations between the US and Bashar al-Assad in Oman. So the shift of policy towards Syria is something that predates Ahmed al-Sharaa's seizure of power this time last year. We have to see these events as being a part of a much longer trend rather than just being related to the person of Ahmed al-Sharaa. Yes, he is popular in many quarters, but that's because he's delivering on the things that Bashar al-Assad either was unwilling or unable to deliver on, whether it was the limitation of Iranian influence in Syria or the expulsion of Iran from Syria, which was a major demand by the Arab countries, whether it was putting an end to the Captagon drug trade, which he wasn't able to do because he relied on it for income, and whether it was reaching an agreement with the SDF, which was a US demand, and in fact the US pushed the SDF to come to an agreement with Bashar al-Assad, and Bashar al-Assad more or less rebuffed those attempts. So everything that has been asked of Ahmed al-Sharaa, some of which he's been able to deliver so far, other things he's yet to deliver on. All of those things were asked of at one time of Bashar al-Assad, and he wasn't able to deliver. So what you have now is a Syrian president who, for various reasons, partly to do with his sectarian background, is able to deliver on the demands of the international community and the demands of the region in a way that Bashar al-Assad wasn't able to do that.
Yeah, you make a good point about how that process of reintegrating Syria back into uh, certainly the Arab world was well underway, and that Ahmed al-Sharaa has delivered. There is something about his personality, though, that seems to engage, particularly people like Donald Trump. But also when he was at the UN, people warmed to him in a way that I don't think they would had the Bashir Assad shown up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've written this before that Ahmed al-Sharaa and Donald Trump have something in common is that they were both insurgents in their own way. They both fought against the establishment. They were on the fringes. They may have been also mocked and ridiculed, and yet against all the odds, they managed to get to the top. So I guess, Donald Trump respects, I guess, people who have that ability. But also, I mean, the similarity between the two also extends to politics, where you can say that both are right-wing populists, again, in their own way and in their own contexts. Obviously, it helps that Ahmed al-Sharaa is considered to be good looking. That goes a long way. It also helps that Ahmed al-Sharaa says different things to different people. I think he's very well at reading the audience, and so people tend to see in him what they want to see. And if you actually look at his speeches, for example, whether those directed at a Syrian audience or an international audience, they tend to be very vague. I would also go as far as to say that sort of bland. There's nothing spectacular in what he has to say, um, but he's not a great orator. So it becomes very easy for people to project onto him what they want a Syrian leader to look like or to be about. And I think that's, in his defense, that's probably something he's harnessed quite well. But does anyone actually know who Ahmed al-Sharaa is beyond, let's say, the personality that he decides to show his interviewer?
Intriguing thought there, Malik. Look, I wanted to ask you about the recent killings of Druze sheikhs in Sweden, allegedly at the hands of another Druze sheikh. What can you tell our listeners about that? And what does it say about the ongoing sectarian situation in Syria?
Well, I mean, this particular incident that you refer to, it involves three Druze sheikhs, Ra'id al-Matini, Mahir Falhout, and Marwan Rizet. What's interesting is we're seeing in Sweden shades of the Lebanese civil war, specifically in the 1980s when the Christian factions fought against each other and what became known as the unification of the Christian rifle. In other words, the Christians cannot afford to have more than one armed faction. And so the various factions fought against each other. And it was a very bloody period in the history of the Lebanese civil war. We're seeing something similar in Sweden, where who represents the Druze now is very important. In the past, you could have, let's say, a pluralism of representation, because in the past, when Bashar al-Assad was around, it didn't really matter that much. But now it does because the stakes are much higher. And so it makes sense, unfortunately, for Hikmet al-Hajari to liquidate his opponents so that he is the only leader of the Druze. Unfortunately, this is what happens when identity politics, let's say, becomes militarized in the context of a post-civil war situation.
Yeah, and as you say, there are broader sectarian issues in Syria, but you just come back from Damascus, Malik. What is the mood there, and how are people feeling about the new regime?
Well, I mean, people on the whole are glad that the old regime has disappeared. And the most obvious net positive is, in one word, freedom. I mean, people have a freedom that they didn't enjoy when Bashar al-Assad was around, specifically the freedom to express their opinions, criticize the government, to travel, to not be harassed at checkpoints, not have let's say, the constant threat of being arrested because of a malevolent report that someone had written against you. So that fear has gone, and it's a huge psychological weight of the Syrian people. And that's something that's very discernible. That's probably the biggest net benefit of the toppling of the Assad regime. I mean, recently the interior minister said that around 5 million people had security files against them. And by the way, I was one of them. So it's a huge net benefit for the Syrian people not to have that sense of fear. Beyond that, in terms of day-to-day living, economics, cost of living, I would say things have improved marginally, and I wouldn't give it more than 10 to 15% improvement on this time last year, purely on the issue of economics, cost of living, and so on. Goods are more freely available than they were before, but the state safety net in terms of subsidized fuel and bread have disappeared. And so now market forces play a much more prominent role in pricing. And as a result, prices of many goods have gone up, goods and services, including electricity, which the government recently hiked up the price. Damascus is very expensive. I mean, other cities are perhaps less expensive, but nevertheless, I do fear that if social safety nets are not put in place, or perhaps the UN doesn't get more involved in terms of supporting those social safety nets, then I do fear that in a year or two, there will be a huge disaster in terms of, I mean, not just a humanitarian disaster, but a political one in terms of people coming out on the street saying, we can't afford to live anymore. Anwar Sadat lifted state subsidies and rolled back the socialist policies of Jamal Abdel Nasser, and you ended up with bread riots, essentially. I do fear that scenario if the government doesn't respond quickly enough.
Yes, the price of bread, that's an interesting metric by which to measure the potential for social unrest. It certainly was the situation in Egypt, as you alluded to. But what is the price of bread now in Syria as compared to what it was a year ago?
I mean, the price of bread has shot up considerably, but in dollar terms, the difference isn't that much. I mean, it's mainly because of inflation that the price seems to be has gone up so steeply. The issue really is the government used to subsidize bread, so it didn't cost very much. However, you had to queue for it. Now you don't have to queue for bread anymore, but you have to pay more. So that's the trade-off. And similarly for fuel, you could get subsidized fuel if you have coupons. This was the case before under Bashar al-Assad, where you would go buy fuel for half the price, half the market price. That's all gone now.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and the Syrian analyst Malik al-Abdeh. You know, outside players have significant influence and presence in Syria. So let's begin with the Turks, who were very important in assisting al-Sharaa in defeating the Assad regime. What is Turkey up to, Malik?
Well, I mean, first of all, Turkey is very keen on maintaining Ahmed al-Shara and his regime because the obvious alternative to him is the SDF, Muslim Abdi, or other, let's say, alternatives such as, the name of Manaf Tlas, for example, is being floated around, the son of the former Syrian defense minister. So this is a sort of, let's say, a secular Sunni alternative. Any alternative other than Ahmed al-Shara, in Turkey's eyes, will likely not be very friendly towards Turkey. That's not to say that Ahmed al-Shara is a puppet of Turkey, far from it. I think he's done a lot to keep Turkish ambitions at bay. He's resisted many Turkish demands over the past year, including maritime demarcation, including Turkey having playing a more muscular role in rebuilding the Syrian armed forces, for example. They wanted bases further south to the ones they currently have, and he's pushed back against that. Ahmed al-Shara realizes that Turkey is useful, but Turkey has no option but to support him. And therefore, he needs to diversify. And he's chosen Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia to be his, let's say, principal patron in the region, rather than Turkey. I mean, Turkey also wants to limit the ambitions of the Kurds in Syria in terms of the federalist ambitions. And I think Ahmed al-Shara has been able to limit those successfully so far, although negotiations haven't been completed yet. But Turkey will try to squeeze the Kurds as much as possible. And of course, they need Ahmed al-Shara to do that. Turkey also wants to make money in Syria. I mean, Turkish companies, the same companies who support the AKP in Turkey, the ruling party, they also want to cash in. And so they're moving into Aleppo in a big way. Turkish influence in Aleppo is strong and growing. So yeah, if you want to summarize it, it's to do with maintaining Turkey's influence in Damascus, not just in northern Syria, but in Damascus. Number one, number two, limiting Kurdish ambitions, and number three is to make money and advance Turkey's strategic position. I mean, let's not also forget the gas politics of this conflict. There's talk of a pipeline from Qatar to Turkey via Syria. which would strengthen Turkey's role as a gas superpower. So that's also something to bear in mind when it comes to Turkey.
Okay. Now, the other very significant player is Israel, still with troops in Syria, still playing the sectarian card game.
Yeah, I mean, I think Israel perhaps didn't expect that the Bashar al-Assad regime would collapse so quickly. Israel's game may have been, well, let them fight it out in Aleppo and see both sides weakened. So Israel didn't expect Ahmed al-Sharaa to capture power so rapidly, so quickly. And yeah, they're now playing a divide and rule game. They've stated very clearly that their allies in Syria are the minorities, that they are there to protect the minorities, regardless of how genuine they are when it comes to this. I mean, they probably mean it when it comes to the Druze, although it's a transactional relationship. I'm not sure what they can do for the Kurds, for example, or the Alawites for that matter. But regardless, Israel has territorial ambitions in Syria. I think, when you speak to people in the know in Israel, they'll tell you that this is a golden opportunity for Israel to expand northwards, to grab more territory, because Syria hasn't been this weak militarily for decades. And so this is an opportunity worth seizing.
So you think it's likely the Israelis are going to stay? The IDF is in place and is not about to leave.
Yes, and most likely they will encroach on further territory and they will try to grab more territory as possible. Now, I don't think that they plan on staying on keeping those territories forever. I mean, some of those territories they might try to annex, to add to the Golan Heights that they annexed in 1981. But at the same time, I mean, for example, the Mount Hermon, I don't think they're going to give that up. But they might give up less consequential territory here and there, but in return for humiliating conditions on the part of the Syrians. And this is something that Mohammed al-Shara has been trying to resist because he knows that if he agrees to Netanyahu's conditions, which is essentially having the whole of the south of Syria becoming a demilitarized zone, this is a huge impingement on Syrian sovereignty. But also, perhaps even more humiliating, is to have a corridor from the Golan Heights, Israeli occupied Golan Heights, to Sweda in order for Israel to reinforce and resupply the Druze. And that condition was rejected point blank, I mean, by Ahmed al-Shara. And yet it seems that Netanyahu is insisting on this condition. So ultimately, it's a question of who blinks first. And what's interesting is that I think there's a decision taken by the Syrian leadership to inflict losses on the Israelis, or at least make them pay a price for their continued occupation of Syrian territory. And we saw that in the Beit Jin incident, where over 10 Israeli soldiers were wounded, I think a number of them seriously, in an exchange of fire with locals who decided to resist the encroachment. And I think we're likely to see more of these incidents, which would shed light on, at least it would give ammunition to those inside Israel who are questioning whether this is actually, this whole very aggressive policy towards Syria is in Israel's own interest.
So perhaps some wriggle room there for al-Sharaa. I'm thinking too about other players, those who were once significant backers of the old regime, that's the Russians and Iran. Are they pretty much a spent force in Syria now, Malik?
Not at all. I mean, the Iranians are obviously licking their wounds at this stage, but don't rule them out. I mean, maybe it's difficult for them to restore their influence in the way they had under Bashar al-Assad. However, they have two cards that I think worth keeping a close eye on. One is the coastal card, i.e., their relationship with the Alawites. I mean, the Alawites, of course, are not Shia, 12 Shia. The Alawites are a different, entirely different sect altogether. But there is a feeling among Iranians and Shia that the Alawites are closest to them than let's say, Sunnis. And so Iran will always find a following among the Alawites, not huge, but they do have a following among Alawites. and they are keen to maintain and expand that influence within the Alawites in the same way as Israel has been able to invest in a relationship with the Druze and therefore expand its influence in Syria via the Druze. I think Iran will try to do the same and is trying to do the same with Alawites and keep a close look on movements in the coast, calling for demonstrations, calling for strikes. I mean, there's a strike going on now as we speak, which has been called for by Alawite religious figures, some of whom may or may not be connected to Iran. I mean, that's still yet to be established. The other card that Iran has to play is against Israel. And if Syria feels like it has no option, it may seek at a future point to restore relations with Iran, to strengthen itself against Israel. We might see a return to the old Astana alliance, which was Turkey, Russia, and Iran, as a way of balancing, Western slash Israeli influence in Syria. So Iran still has cards to play.
And the Russians?
With regards to Russia, I mean, Russia hasn't left Syria. I mean, this is a they may have vacated some of their positions, but they are still present in the northeast, in Qamishli airport. They're on the coast, and now the Syrian government and Turkey has invited the Russians to the south of Syria in order to allay Israeli fears about jihadists launching surprise attacks against northern Israel. And the Russians were in southern Syria when Bashar al-Assad was around. They left when Bashar fell. Now, a year later, they're back in southern Syria. So the Russians are, I think, they're likely to be a long-term influence in Syria. They might not be the decisive influence. I think the US has stolen a march on them, but they are needed. They are needed power in Syria to create balance. They're needed by Turkey to balance out Israel. They're needed by the Syrian government for a whole range of reasons, including that the Syrian government doesn't want to clash with Russia, but also they need Russian weapons. So the Russians will likely continue to be around, I mean, not just in Syria, but in the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole.
Well, finally, Malik, as we head into 2026, what are your hopes and fears for Syria under Ahmed al-Sharaa?
One of the things that I learned from my recent trip to Syria was that a lot of the good things that you see in the country, such as you would expect there to be sort of rampant crime or breakdown of law and order, because really and truly the security forces are stretched very thinly, and you'd expect there to be chaos or acts of terrorism, for example, given the ISIS presence. And yet you don't see any of that. And a large part of the answer why is the Syrian people themselves. I mean, they have such resilience and such ability to, quote unquote, move on, i.e., not to dwell too much on the past, to look forward, to keep living, if you like. And there's a great deal of responsibility the ordinary Syrians have taken on in their own community to improve things. You can call it civil society, but it's not civil society in the, let's say, conventional sense in terms of, let's say, civil society NGOs. It's even more grassroots than that. And that's what gives me hope. Everywhere you go in and around Damascus, and this is the area of Syria where I'm from, you'll see, local community centers popping up, local initiatives. And this is not the government. This is not the government's work, although sometimes the government likes to jump on board these initiatives and claim it for itself. These are just ordinary people. And so a lot of people are prepared to overlook some of the failures of the government in the past year. They're prepared to overlook issues they have, maybe with the style of leadership so far, because they want to work for the good of the country as a whole. And also because they realize that, perhaps it's a long game. Even if you want to change things politically, you can't really do that now in an immediate post-war setting, but perhaps in 2, 3 years' time, things will settle down and you can start working towards some of the idealistic goals that many many revolutionaries, many activists had. But right now, what we need to do is to work on shelter, basic services, housing, improving people's condition, getting people to work together, like really basic things. And then we can think about the bigger things later. And really, truly, that has been a blessing for Ahmed al-Sharaa and his administration, because if people were to nitpick over every single, faux pas or mistake they've done, there'd be in a lot of trouble. But the Syrian people have just allowed things to slide, let's put it that way, because they're deep down, they have a sixth sense. They know that, look, not everything's going to change immediately, and let's work on at the community level, at the very local level. It's something to be really proud of, and it actually excites me every time I go back to Syria and I see the changes.
Yeah, and that's what can carry Syria forward into a better society and a better place for the Syrian people. But do you not think there is a danger that Ahmed al-Sharaa would become the next dictator, or will this be finally the page turned, the revolution, all the suffering, all the losses that the people of Syria have experienced, that this finally is going to change for the better for them?
I mean, this question of whether Syria will be a democracy or not, I mean, many people will tell you that we don't want a democracy, and they say that not because they genuinely don't want a democracy or they feel democracy is bad. On the contrary, they say that because they think it's too early for Syria to turn into a democracy with, I mean, let's face it, and this is something the government perhaps cannot admit to its public, but the fact is the conflict isn't over. The war isn't over. You still have fightings, often, frequent skirmishes with the SDF. You have, fighting with Sweden. You have thousands of Alawite insurgents in the mountains and the coast that no one's talking about. So the war hasn't been settled. And until the war is settled, and the terms of that settlement hasn't even been decided. I mean, yes, we have a president and we have a constitutional declaration and so on, but these are not set in stone. The constitution is likely to change. The composition of parliament is likely to change. I think this will take a number of years before we get to a settlement that all Syrians are that meets, let's say, all the bottom lines of the major communities in Syria. So we just have to be we have to wait. I mean, the other thing regarding democracy is that, I mean, and this is no defense of Ahmed al-Shara, but if you look at the last 14, 15 years, ever since the Tunisian uprising and then the Egyptian uprising and so on, and the Arab Spring era, two models emerged: the political Islam model of the Muslim Brotherhood and, let's say, the democracy model, such as in Tunisia. And both of them didn't work for a variety of reasons, partly because powerful Arab interests didn't want them to work, but also perhaps because the parties that pushed forward those agendas perhaps weren't best placed to strategize, and they weren't tactically proficient to survive. Ahmed al-Shara has reached the conclusion perhaps that, look, we need to do something in between. We're not going to go back to old school Arab authoritarianism, but at the same time, we can't go to political Islam, I think partly because he doesn't believe in it. And we can't do full democracy either because the Saudis and the Emiratis and so on, they'll turn against us. And they're too powerful. They'll crush us if they want to. So he's decided to do this halfway house, which is a bit of a cult of personality, uh, kind of authoritarianism light, with the appearance of democracy, with some room for freedom of speech, freedom of expression. They say there's a political parties law around the corner. I think we're most likely going to end up with a regime that is perhaps more similar to that of Jordan, where it's tolerable. It's not exactly a police state, and yet everything is well controlled.
Mm, mm,
That's the sort of the this is what most Syrians that I've been speaking to, this is what they say, well, we expect to end up in that kind of regime. if things continue as they are now.
Okay.
And
Well,
frankly, that's something that I think many Syrians are prepared to live with, just to be just to be blunt.
yep, yep. Okay. Well, that's it'll be interesting to watch. It's 1 year in now, and we'll see how 2026 moves the story forward. But we'll get you back for that, Malik. But for now, I thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you, Bill. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was the Syrian analyst and commentator Malik al-Abdeh. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East, North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. Head to the website, arabdigest.org, and look out for the offer of a free 2-month trial to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. We thank you for listening. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.